Welcome to ACC Position U, the show where we examine which ACC school has the best tradition at each position. Today, it's the defensive line. We have a terrific panel of experts that will help us decide which school will be designated as Defensive Line U. But before we meet them, let's look at the criteria that was used in determining our finalists. First, we looked at how successful the players were in college. Second, we considered their NFL draft position. And finally, we looked at their NFL careers. Also, since the makeup of the ACC changed over the years, we considered all players from a school's history, whether they played in the ACC at that time or not. And while the players from the last 20 to 25 years are fresher in our minds, we didn't limit our selections to just the recent past. There can certainly be arguments made for other schools, but based on that criteria right there, we narrowed it down to 4 schools as our finalists at defensive line: Clemson, Florida State, Miami, and NC State. Now let's meet our esteemed panel to debate the merits of our finalists. Roddy Jones was a 4-year starting running back at Georgia Tech and now is an analyst at ESPN and ACC Network. Andrea Adelson is a college football writer who covers ACC sports for ESPN.com. And Wes Bryant was an offensive lineman for Wake Forest, is now a host at ACC Digital Network. Thank you guys all for being here. We appreciate it very much. We're going to start with Clemson right off of the bat and begin with you, Roddy. Who comes to mind at the top of your head when you think of Clemson's defensive line?
Well, I'm going with the most recent leader, the leader of the Power Rangers, if you will, and that's Christian Wilkins. He was a guy that was a 3-time All-American, and by the time he was done as a junior, had already been an All-American twice, decided to come back for his senior season with his buddies, Austin Bryant, Cleland Ferrell, and Dexter Lawrence, that formed that group. They called themselves the Power Rangers, and they were able to win a national championship. He was obviously a first-round pick of the Miami Dolphins, but more than that, this was a guy who was a leader on that Clemson team, was a leader in college football, won the Walter V. Campbell Trophy, the academic Heisman, if you will. Just an all-around great player, an all-around great dude. And by the way, Katie, scored 2 big man touchdowns from the running back position in his Clemson career. Gotta love a big man touchdown, so I go with Christian Wilkins.
You don't see that every day, Roddy, so I appreciate you bringing that up, and I'm sure Christian Wilkins appreciates you bringing that up as well. Andrea, how about you?
If we're talking about big man touchdowns, we should be talking about Refrigerator Perry, also a Clemson defensive lineman. But we can talk about that later. I really want to highlight Vic Beasley, because when you look at this recent run of success that Clemson has had with their defensive linemen, you could make the case that Vic Beasley essentially started it all. And he wasn't even a defensive lineman when he got to Clemson. He was a tight end. They didn't know what to do with him. He moved to linebacker. And then he became a defensive end, and he really thrived in that position with his ability to rush the passer because of his speed. And that's what really set him apart. I really enjoyed watching him play because you always had a feeling that something big was about to happen when he was on the field. 16 sacks, so one season in one of his biggest seasons. And obviously he went on to be a first-round draft pick in the NFL. So Vic Beasley, to me, is what essentially started this run that we've seen for Clemson defensive line.
Yeah, absolutely. He paved the way for more recent guys, right, to get it done up front. Wes, I think you have a more recent guy in mind as well?
Yes, I'm going to go with another one of the Power Rangers, the reincarnation of the refrigerator, you could say, Dexter Lawrence, one of the largest men I've ever seen in person. This guy is just a physical freak, because not only was he just ginormous on that defensive line, but the footwork, the quickness, the strength, the power. This guy had everything you could ask for in an interior defensive lineman. He's a guy that I'm sure a lot of opponents got out there and said, hey, if I get away from him, then he's not going to be able to catch me. And then lo and behold, he's chasing you down the line and putting you down on the ground. I remember seeing this kid in high school, and I was just in awe. I thought the kid was 290 pounds. They told me he was 340. This guy was blocking punts in high school, just unblockable. Followed him all the way to Clemson. Dexter Lawrence was one of my favorite players. I stood beside the guy and interviewed him, and he made me feel like a child. So this guy was just a humongous presence on that defensive line. First round pick by the New York Giants, doing his thing in the NFL.
Making you feel like a child is certainly hard to do. Roddy, obviously Christian and Dexter are more recent selections. And I don't want to age you here and say, but back in your day, are there any ones that we're forgetting from Clemson?
Well, look, back in my day, when you lined up against the Clemson Tigers, you had guys like Gaines Adams, who was the number 4 overall pick, guys like Brandon Thompson and Daquan Bowers, who were big-time recruits coming into Clemson. I'm glad we mentioned the Refrigerator Perry and his brother Michael Dean Perry, who both played at Clemson as well in the 80s. This Clemson DL thing's been going on for a long time, and while we kind of talked about guys that were more recent, guys like Vic Beasley, we didn't mention Grady Jarrett. There's just names that you could go down consistently with Clemson, back from the 80s all the way till now.
But if you are thinking about the recent guys that you just brought up as finalists, Andrea, how much does Brent Venables as a DC play a part in their evolution as defensive linemen at Clemson?
Obviously, he plays a huge part. He's the biggest reason why they were able to get Vic Beasley from tight end to linebacker to defensive end. And he has this ability to see where the talent is with his players and maximize that talent, maximize that potential. And in a few years, we're going to be talking about the Clemson defensive linemen who are there right now. Miles Murphy, Brian Prissy, you can be sure they are going to be added to this long list of Clemson defensive linemen.
Yeah, he's so much fun to watch in and of itself just as a coach on the sidelines, and he definitely knows a thing or two about getting guys right on the field. That wraps up our conversation regarding Clemson. The next contender is Florida State. We'll be back to look at the Seminoles when ACC Position U continues. Welcome back to ACC Position U and our look at the defensive line. The next finalist we'll discuss is Florida State. Andrea, let's start with you. What Seminole lineman stands out as one of the greatest of all time at Florida State?
It has to be Andre Wadsworth, and I know there are a lot of people who maybe forgot about his Florida State career because he didn't live up to the expectations of the NFL because he got injured, but he is absolutely one of the greatest defensive linemen in school history. And when you think about his backstory, the fact that he was not offered any scholarships out of high school, he walked on at Florida State, and then he played both defensive tackle and defensive end. Was the ACC Defensive Player of the Year 97, played alongside Peter Boulware, Renard Wilson, in one of the greatest defensive line combinations at the school. Speaks a lot to who he is in his development, but also the work ethic to get him to a point where he could show off his versatility at Florida State and become a first-round draft pick. And then nearly 20 years later, DeMarcus Walker has 16 sacks for Florida State, which is what Andre Wadsworth had in 1997. And for me, that just illustrates the level of consistency that Florida State has had along their defensive line.
I love stories like that, too, because so many of the players that we discuss in the ACC were highly touted recruits. And he's proof that you don't necessarily need to be a 4-star or a 5-star, that you can actually come into a program as a walk-on and achieve your dreams. And he's a great example of that. Wes, who comes to mind for you when you think FSU defensive line?
Well, I'm going to take it to a guy in the middle of that defensive line talking about Big Corey Simon, old 53. This guy was an absolute game wrecker for the nose. Big wide body down in there, but again, another one that had the feet, the quickness, explosion, the strength. He was really an anchor for those defensive lines. He was a consecutive All-American as a senior, and he went on to have a solid NFL career with the Philadelphia Eagles, and where he was a Pro Bowler as well. So I'm a big Corey Simon fan, and he had pretty good swag too for a defensive lineman. But this guy was certainly disruptive and wrecked a lot of teams' game plans on Saturday.
I feel like this is a theme for Wes here, that if the player has some swag, he's got his eye on that.
Gotta have it. He wore a big wide collar at the back. Sweet.
Yeah, I love it. Roddy, how about you?
Well, I just love that the former lineman is the one that's talking about the swag. I love it, Wes.
Yes.
Let's go.
Yes.
For me, I'm going recent. I'm going Brian Burns. When you design a defensive end in a lab, you're going to design a guy that's tall, that's twitchy, it's got long arms, it's got great bend. Brian Burns had all of that. 5-star recruit coming into Florida State, exploded on the scene as a freshman with 9.5 sacks. His junior year, 10 sacks. He's 5th all time in FSU history. In FSU history, it's not just anywhere. in sacks, and then was a first-round pick of the Carolina Panthers, where he started to really catch fire there and started to really improve under Matt Rule. So I'm going with Brian Burns because of what he was to that team at that time. He didn't get there when they were rolling national champions, or he didn't play there when they were rolling national champions. He played there a little bit after they had reached their peak under Jimbo Fisher, but Brian Burns still stood out. He was an excellent player.
It's so hard to pare these lists down, right? You don't want to leave anybody off, but it's hard to do. We've highlighted a couple here. Is there anybody that you think merits a little bit more discussion that maybe could have made that list or flew under the radar?
I definitely would go with, we'd be remiss not to talk about Renard Wilson, FSU's all-time leading sacker. In 1996, this guy had 105 tackles at the defensive end spot to go with 13 and a half sacks. It seemed like he and Peter Bower would just have meetings at the quarterback. They got off on that, and this guy was absolutely disruptive. But again, 105 tackles at the defensive end spot, that's unheard of. So we definitely need to give him his roses as well.
Ronnie?
Yeah, and I'm going to go with Bjorn Werner, a guy in the early 2000 teens that was a first-round pick, the big German. He's a guy that's often overlooked, but this dude really set the tone for what those defensive lines became under Jimbo Fisher. An excellent player, a big guy that was tough to move in the run game, a really hard worker, and a first-round pick. So I'm going to go Bjorn Werner, the big German.
All right. Well done, you three. Forward we go. That's it for the Noles. We'll take a look at the Miami Hurricanes and the NC State Wolfpack when we return. Warren Sapp, Mario Williams, and more on ACC Position U. Welcome back to ACC Position U. We have two more schools to consider in our look at defensive linemen, Miami and NC State. Wes, let's start with you. Who set the standard for Miami defensive linemen?
Well, if you wanted to put a definition of defensive line anchor, you would put Vince Wilfork. This guy was an absolute force in the middle of that Miami defensive line. Never quite knew what the weight was. They would list him at 330, 340, but he looked a little heavier than that out there. But he used all of that to wreck opponents' game plans. Speed, power, quickness, and went about 360, 365 on that national championship Miami team, and just an absolute freak athlete. And then, oh yeah, first round pick to the New England Patriots, where he was a 5-time Pro Bowler and 2-time Super Bowl champion. So hats off to Vince Wilfork.
I'm always in awe of this position because not only are they so big and they're carrying so much weight, but they've got such quick feet. They could be dancers, quite honestly, which is just amazing.
The dancing bears are what they call us, Katie. You know,
I love it. I love it. That's very accurate. Roddy, how about you?
Well, along with the athleticism, I'm impressed at how good they look in a pair of overalls with no shirt, like Vince Wilfork does, certainly as well. But I'm going to go with Calais Campbell, who may not be top of mind when you talk about Miami defensive linemen. There's so many greats that he often gets pushed down the list a little bit. This is a guy that's been in the NFL for 14 years now. He's a 6-time Pro Bowler, first-team All-Pro, won the Walter Payton Man of the Year award. So not only a giant man at 6'8", almost 300 pounds, but also a giant in the community and what he's done. Put together an NFL Hall of Fame type career. So that NFL career gets him into that category of great Miami offensive linemen. Had some great stats in Miami too, but what he's been able to do in the NFL, Hall of Fame type career from Calais Campbell.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I hope, Andrea, you're about to talk about one of my favorite players whose name rhymes with Lauren Tapp.
Look, guys, no disrespect to Vince and to Calais and Cortez Kennedy and all the other guys. There's only one Miami defensive lineman we should be talking about right now. And yes, it rhymes with Warren Tapp.
Warren
Sapp. Yes, it's Warren Sapp, the menace of the Miami defensive line, the greatest Miami defensive lineman to ever play. I grew up in South Florida. I watched every single Miami Hurricanes football game until I went off to college. And every time Warren Sapp lined up in the early 90s for Miami, I used to just get these like giggles because I would be so excited to see what he would do. namely taking down quarterbacks with a force that's hard to describe. And forget about Dominican Sue. Everyone talks about him being a Heisman candidate. Warren Sapp was 6th in the Heisman Trophy voting 1 year, won everything you could possibly win, and then goes and wins, becomes an NFL Hall of Famer, wins a Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Bucks, also won a championship his redshirt freshman year. So that I've said it. It's definitive. We don't need to talk about it anymore. It's Warren Sapp.
It's a long list, Andrea, for sure. Okay, let's shift our focus to NC State. Roddy, we'll begin with you. Who comes to mind when you think about that NC State line up front?
Well, I know that Andrea and Wes are going to bring it with some of these defensive linemen, but I'm going Bradley Chubb. He is one of my favorite linemen since I've gotten out of school and been covering the ACC and college football at large. He's one of my absolute favorites to have watched. He was a massive defensive lineman with great feet, like you guys talked about earlier, length, technique, but he played so hard at NC State and anchored a really good defensive line there, worked himself to the point where he was a top 10 draft pick, number 5 overall. So Bradley Chubb is that guy for me, an absolute menace on that defensive line, and a guy that has started to really catch fire, made a Pro Bowl in 2020, started to catch fire in the NFL as well.
You know it's a good thing when you're described as a menace. So, Andrea, you brought the heat when talking about Miami. Who you got for NC State?
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but there's really only one NC State defensive lineman we need to be talking about, and that's Mario Williams, who I'm not sure if people remember, but he was the first number 1 overall pick in ACC history. And so that just speaks to what he was able to accomplish in his career there. And I think what really, for me, stands out about Mario is he was right there at the beginning of this transition that we saw from defensive ends who were kind of hulking and big to rush ends who used more of their speed and athleticism to get after the quarterback. And I think he was one of the first who was really able to put that entire complete package together at NC State, and obviously went on to become a number 1 overall pick, as I just mentioned. I just think he put it all together, and now there are so many more rush ends who are in the mold of Mario Williams.
Wes, round it out for us. Who you got for NC State?
Well, I'm going to go a couple spots down the defensive line from Mario Williams to his teammate Manny Lawson. This guy was an absolute problem. I have personal history with him as I had to deal with him for a few years in my time at Wake Forest. When we played this defensive line, it was definitely all hands on deck. And that was because you had the speed and power of Mario Williams, and then you just had the cat-like quickness and just all-out ridiculous first step of Manny Lawson. 21 sacks in his career at NC State, 41 tackles for loss. And quickly, when we played them one time, our running back was a 4-4 running back. Chris Barclay was an ACC Player of the Year. One time, Manny Lawson bit and came in the backfield on a fake, came all the way down inside, and then we ran some trickery. He caught our 4-4 running back before he got to the line of scrimmage on the wide side. So this guy was certainly just, an absolute animal on that defensive line, and was just a problem with all that speed. And, he was 6'5" or 6'6" as well, so he had the length. So Manny Lawson, definitely an underrated player on that packed defensive line, but certainly a problem for many during his tenure.
Well, you know what they say, iron sharpens iron, and that was certainly the case for that NC State defensive line. We've stated our case here for the finalist. Which school will our panel of experts pick as defensive line U in the ACC? That's next when we return on ACC Position U. Welcome back to ACC Position U, a quick review of the criteria we're working for. We considered college careers, NFL draft positions, and NFL careers in total as we selected these finalists. And now the moment of truth. Who does our panel think has the best defensive line legacy in ACC football? Roddy, you get to do the honors.
I'm going with Clemson. And here's why. Look, you
it's
look
a
at
tiny
NC
helmet,
State.
by the way.
I know, it is a teeny tiny helmet. That's why I tried to get it close so it looked a little bigger. I know Florida State's got an excellent lineage. Miami, obviously, names in the history. But what Dabo Swinney has done, in the Dabo Swinney era, he's got more draft picks on the defensive line than anybody in the ACC. He's got more first-rounders, more first and second rounders than anybody in the ACC. And let me tell you guys, you guys know this. It's not stopping. It is not stopping with Brian Brzee and Miles Murphy there. You talk about the first-round picks, the dominance, the fact that they've had defensive line that have powered this team to national championship level. And we already talked about the fact that it goes back years, decades, to Michael Dean Perry and William the Refrigerator Perry. So I went with Clemson with my defensive line U.
All right, strong pick. Andrea, is he accurate or is he talking crazy?
What he said. Do I need to keep going? I mean, Roddy just pointed it out perfectly. And the reason I picked Clemson is because of the longevity, right? We're not just talking about only now in the Dabo Swinney era. You know, Gaines Adams, Daquan Bowers, the Perry brothers, that goes back all the way into the 1980s. And when I looked at it, my criteria is college success, NFL success, and are you doing it over a long period of time? And that's why I went with Clemson. But I do want to point this out really quickly. ESPN.com does their own position U rankings every single year. And Florida State actually ranks ahead of Clemson, not by a lot, but Florida State is number 2, I believe. And if you go and look at all the all ACC football teams, there's usually a Florida State defensive lineman on there. But I went with Clemson because of not just what they've done recently, but also going back well before the Florida State legacy started.
And I don't think younger fans appreciate that, right? I mean, because you just think of the recent guys who are now currently in the league. So great job by you two in bringing up the past and the history that has been at Clemson. Wes, did they sway you? Is this going to be a sweep?
No, they did not sway me. Look, I used to chop all the time back in the 90s, but I will not chop today. But I went with the Seminoles, so at least ESPN agrees with me. You talk about the lineage and the history. You go back in the 90s, early 2000s, these guys absolutely just dominated games. You could argue they were the premier unit on that football team year in and year out when they were dominating the polls and finishing top 5, whether you're talking about Peter Bower, Raynard Wilson, Corey Simon, all the guys we named, even underrated guys like Cam Wembley, who was a first-round pick, I believe, for the Cleveland Browns. So I'm going to go with the nose. Not quite, the lineage is not continuing right now, maybe, so to speak, but when you look at the totality and how this group just dominated ACC football through the 90s and the early 2000s, I went with the nose, but no chop today.
Wow.
Wes was almost out of breath as he was listing off player after player after player. You made a convincing argument, Wes, which we appreciate. But unfortunately, your Seminoles lose today. 2-1 goes to Clemson. Congratulations to Clemson for being named Defensive Line U in the ACC. That's all for now. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of ACC Position U.